Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my colleague, editor of Forbes Women, Maggie McGrath. Maggie, thanks so much for coming on in.
Thanks for having me.
I want to extend a big congratulations to you. Forbes' list of the world's most powerful women has officially dropped, so congrats on that. And you and I talked about last year's list. I asked for the inspiration behind it, and you called it more of a necessity to track the women who are moving and changing the world. Do you still feel that way, this list?
I feel that way more than ever before. In our reporting at Forbes Women, have been seeing a lot of different polling around the sentiment towards female leaders. I spoke to Michelle Harrison, the founder of something called the Reykjavik Global Index. They look at how people in developed economies view female leaders, and are you comfortable with female leaders? And across G7 countries, these are the most advanced economies in the world, the perception of female leaders is shakier than ever before. And here in the US, we just went through a presidential election where a woman yet again failed to reach the highest office in the land. So I think a lot of people are questioning, at least in the US, what will it take for a woman to ascend to that highest office? Do people trust women's leadership? And this list is full of CEOs, ministers of finance, CFOs. We have a few founders, we have some VCs. These are people who are already making really big decisions. And so when people ask me, can women lead? I say yes. And these are the women who are already doing it.
And these are women who are leaders in every industry, from media and entertainment to philanthropy to finance, everything in between. But I want to talk about logistics first. How are the women getting selected to be on this list?
So unlike some other Forbes lists where we ask for submissions and we want ideas from people, this list is an accounting of who's in power. So we basically look at the largest countries in the world. Well, really, we look at every country in the world and we say, who's the president, who's the prime minister? Then we look at the GDP, we look at the population, we look at media mentions. These are all metrics of hard power. It's how much money are you commanding? How many people do you oversee? How much are you in the media using this hard and soft power of the media? So we do that for politics and policy. We do that for finance, business, technology, media and entertainment, and philanthropy. So we essentially assess who are the power players, who are the CEOs of the largest companies, who are the CFOs. So there are some companies that are male-founded, male-led at the CEO role, but we know those CFOs make a lot of important decisions that affect the shape of the company, the stock price of the company. I'm alluding to NVIDIA as one example, and we'll get into other examples, but it's really assessing who sits in the seats of power. The only one that's a little subjective, and we can get into that, is number 100, which ever since I became Forbes Women editor, we use the number 100 spot to highlight someone who is not commanding hard power in the sense that they have a GDP or a massive company at their feet, but rather someone who drove the narrative of a year.
And I think the number 100 this year really did drive that narrative. But first, let's talk about one from 99, because you're saying this is data driven. We're looking at the metrics here. So give us an overview of the 2024 list.
So Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, is number one for the third year in a row. She oversees a huge population and policy for the EU. Effectively, she was reelected this summer, so she will be in that seat of power for a few more years. Number two is Christine Lagarde, the head of the ECB. Number three is Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy. Number four is new to the power list, new to the top five. That's Claudia Sheinbaum. She's Mexico's president. She's the first female president in Mexico's history as an independent country, so first female president in 200 years. Side note on her that I happen to love, she's a scientist by training. She has her PhD in energy engineering. She's authored 100 papers on energy and sustainable development. So someone who has had many evolutions of her career and has ultimately ascended to a very powerful position, and one that will be ever more powerful if you think about the negotiations between the U.S. and Mexico in the incoming administration. And rounding out the top five is Mary Barra. She is the CEO of General Motors, one of the biggest car companies in the world.
You mentioned one newcomer, Claudia Sheinbaum, the first female president in Mexico. I want to talk about another power player from the UK, Rachel Reeves. Talk to us about her?
She is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I have had to look up that pronunciation a dozen times, but she is effectively the British equivalent of what we would say is the Secretary of the Treasury or a Minister of Finance in another country. She oversees Britain's budget. She's in charge of economic policy, managing the economy. It's a very powerful position within the British government, within the European. Well, I guess they left the EU, didn't they, in Brexit? But it's a very powerful position in her country. And what's notable is she's the first woman in that seat in hundreds of years. So she's breaking a glass ceiling, at least in the UK.
And I think going off of that, a trend you saw overall on the list has to do with women in finance roles. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So I did talk to Michelle Harrison over at the Reykjavik Global Index because finance is one area in which global sentiment towards female leadership has not dipped. People are relatively confident of women's ability to lead financial and economic institutions. So we see that in Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citigroup. We see that in the woman I just mentioned, Rachel Reeves. Colette Kress is the CFO of NVIDIA, which of course we've seen that stock on a huge tear. We have the CFO of Meta, Susan Lee. There are a number of CFOs on this list, and you could argue, should they be in the finance category? Should they be in the tech category? They sit at the intersection of really important businesses and work. And I'm trying to think of one or two other examples for you. But if you go through and look who touches money, who touches economies, who touches finance, a large portion of the list oversees that type of work.
And are there any other industries that you see different trends in, it changing at all when it comes to power players that are women in those industries in different roles perhaps?
Honestly, this year what commanded our attention the most was really the politics and policy. You know, we had an election here and we have a changing of the tide in the administration. So the officials who were in charge in 2023, like Kamala Harris, Janet Yellen, we had Linda Thomas Greenfield, the UN ambassador. Those three women are about to be out of their positions in mid-January. So in the same way that if a CEO announces in November that they are leaving their position effective January, we would remove that CEO from the power list. So we removed those three women from the power list, and in one of their places, at least, we have Susie Wiles, the incoming White House Chief of Staff for President-elect Trump. So she makes her debut on the power list under the title of Trump Campaign Co-Chair, because that's most relevant to 2024. And next year, we'll watch her work as White House Chief of Staff and see where she moves from there.
Something that really stood out to me in the beginning of this conversation is you saying that in 2024, there are still questions. It's shakier than ever if women could lead. Is there a perception that women can lead? And it almost sounds like conversations that were happening back in 2016 when Hillary Clinton did not win the presidency. So why do you think we're still having these conversations in 2024?
That is the billion-dollar question in my mind. And my sources have been saying that as much as I like to point to the power list as examples that women lead, that it takes more than one, it takes more than a few. So that is part of the problem, right? If you look at the McKinsey Women in the Workplace report that consistently talks about the broken rung to leadership, so you have better gender representation at lower levels of a company's hierarchy, and then you get to the C-suite and women still are not half of the C-suite or still are not half of the boards that run corporate America. So there's this persistent underrepresentation that I think leads to questions. That's kind of one tranche of attitudes and explanation. There is, of course, the polling that we've seen in the US, in the UK, really around the world among Gen Z. Gen Z men are skewing more conservative, and it's almost this backlash to the Me Too era of 2017, where men are questioning their place in society, and I think in turn wishing for a past where men were felt more secure in their leadership. And maybe the work that we all have going forward is to make sure people understand that when there is equal representation, that actually benefits everyone. Companies are more profitable. We say that over and over again. So that's just two potential hypotheses, but it is a question I am going to continue to be asking sources, because when you see the power that the women on this list command, you know that women can lead. So why is it a question?
On a more positive note, Forbes has been doing this list now for 20 years. So what stands out to you?
It's a great question, and it's a good point, because while we perhaps fret over the state of women's leadership right now, it's really interesting to me to go back and look at the power lists in prior years. I actually pulled the 2004 list, and it shows how much the world has changed. Number one that year was Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor in the United States, which is a powerful role, right? But I would argue that having women running the EU and the ECB and the first female president of Mexico really shows the progress. It also, by the way, we had in the top 5 First Lady Laura Bush, which is, I think we've evolved the way we've looked at the list, and that is more soft power, because First Ladies, while they can shape the way their spouse is looking at policy and promote initiatives of their own, is not quite the same as overseeing a GDP or a population. And I was also noting that back in the early 2000s, when we did this list, we put individual Supreme Court justices on the list. And I think you have to look at the Supreme Court as a whole, right? It's 9. And what's beautiful now is you have female CEOs, CFOs, venture capitalists with significant assets under management, philanthropists like Melinda French Gates and Mackenzie Scott and Laureen Powell Jobs, who are putting their fortunes towards solving some of the world's biggest problems. I think we don't have to think as creatively to fill this list, and instead we can just look at who has the money. And while it's still not 50%, it has grown significantly.
But you think very creatively when it comes to the number 100 spot, because last year in our conversation, the number 100 spot was Barbie, and you said that really showed that soft power. This year is another person with that soft power. So explain what you mean by soft power again, and then tell us who's number 100.
So it's a fun cocktail party conversation if you start asking people, like, who do you think is the most powerful woman in the world? And you'd be really surprised, or maybe not, at how many people will say someone who's not an elected leader and who's not a CEO. In other words, someone they see as powerful, but by the Forbes metrics of money, people, media mentions, reach, they wouldn't crack the top 100 or even 200. So that got me thinking about, well, what is power? And there is soft power. So going back to 2019, the first year we did this, that year it was Greta Thunberg, because she led a climate march that captured the world's attention, and she, despite not being an elected leader, had the 3rd most media mentions of anyone on the power list that year. This year, number 100 is Caitlin Clark. She is the WNBA star, number 1 overall draft pick in the WNBA, of course, broke all sorts of NCAA records for men and for women. I have talked to a lot of women in sports about this year for women in sports. Deloitte last year said it would be a $1 billion market. There's another report out from Wasserman's Women Collective that said just the value of the WNBA and the NWSL, so women's basketball and soccer, that's poised to increase another $1.6 billion. There is a lot of money and a lot of attention going to women's sports. And I've talked to sources, including Dawn Staley, the famous basketball coach, and I've said, like, hey, women have been operating at a high level for a number of years, more than just Caitlin Clark, right? We've seen phenomenal female athletes. So what is it at that point in time? And everyone from Dawn Staley to analysts will say Caitlin Clark is a lightning rod who brought more attention to the fact that women are playing at a high level. And I don't know how many conversations I've had this year about the power of women in sports, but she stands as an example for what I think, aside from the elections, has been the other dominant storyline of the year, which is the power of female athletes.
And even just on personal notes, I've been seeing many more people buying tickets to women's games, tuning in, posting about it on social media. So it really seems like it has that staying power. But I ask you this every year that you and I talk about your lists. What is one word that you can think of to describe this year's 2024 list?
Tough.
Well, tough it is, and I hope everyone reads it, number 1 through 100. Maggie McGrath, thank you for your reporting. Congratulations again.
Thank you.